Hi, everybody. Welcome to Teaching in the Arts, my podcast. Thanks for coming back. Jacob Sweet from the Old Town School of Folk Music is my guest today. We're beginning to make a little bit of a pivot over the next couple of episodes. Jacob has been a teacher at Old Town for 21 plus years, but he doesn't teach college. All the other guests to this point have taught college, but we had a great conversation. We talk about, among other things, Glenn Campbell, Kenny Aronoff. Really, we get into the weeds about teaching. We had a really great discussion about teaching and about classes at the Old Town School of Folk Music and what it's like to be a student there. It's a really good conversation that's coming up in a minute. A couple bits of news beforehand. We got my first email from a listener, so thank you. And it actually goes back to episode 1. And at the end of that episode, when Bill Bacon and I were talking, Bill said that I gave him some advice when he started teaching, and he said that I told him, don't F it up, except I didn't say F. And the email I got was someone suggested perhaps I should have said don't screw it up instead of that. So to that, I want to say I apologize, but I want to remind my dad that one of our favorite family films is Hopscotch, and Ned Beatty's character in Hopscotch refers to the FBI as the effing ball-busting imbeciles over and over and over, and we've laughed at that for 30-some years. So I think he can forgive me an F-bomb every now and then. But anyway, please send me those emails. I appreciate it, and send me some suggestions for guests. So the lesson of the day today is this. I'm recording this on Wednesday, February 21st. It's going to drop Monday, the 26th. It's the first episode that will be released and first I've recorded since the shooting in Florida, the school shooting in Florida. And of course, I don't have to add to the message of how horrible it is. We all know that it is horrible, but it has gone on too long. I wrote a blog post 11 years ago after the shooting at Northern Illinois University, which followed the shooting at Virginia Tech University. Folks, we got to take guns out of people's hands. I started 2 film schools, and one film school we had a rule: no guns, no guns. And if there was a gun, it had to be off screen. And I tried to bring that rule to the school I ran in California, and it met with great resistance because there are a lot of genre screenwriting teachers there that work in the industry. And they said, well, my living is made by writing screenplays with guns in them. But there's nothing more terrifying to me than seeing a young student walking down a hall in a school building with a prop gun. There's just no reason for that. You don't know it's a prop gun or not, and it's just tragic. And I also want to just shout out to Emma Gonzalez, the student in Florida who does the We Call BS speech. If you haven't seen it on YouTube, go see that. It is absolutely amazing. That is one brave young woman, and I hope that those students make a change, and I hope everyone goes and joins the march in Washington. So that is the lesson for today. A little bit more serious than other times. So my guest is Jacob Sweet. He is at the Old Town School of Folk Music, and we just really talk about teaching in the arts. It is why this podcast exists. We had a really, really great discussion, and here it is now. So Jacob Sweet, welcome.
Thank you.
We're finally making this happen after some backs and forths and weather and sick kids and things like that.
Yeah, totally.
Good. I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure.
So before we get deep into it, I was on your website and I've got two pressing questions. You played in a chicken coop?
Yes.
You did a gig in a chicken coop?
I did. That was a long time ago. Actually, it was when I was amazingly still a teenager. A group that I was performing in at the time got hired to play a show in Bermuda, and which was a pretty amazing opportunity. And we got there, and it turned out that where they were having us perform was in a chicken coop.
I hope they were free-range chickens and pasture raised and all that stuff.
Yeah, fortunately they had gotten rid of the chickens before we played. So
was it a good gig?
Yeah, it was.
How was the acoustics?
It was pretty live acoustics. It was a lot of cement and barbed wire, or not barbed wire, but wire.
Yeah, chicken wire.
Yeah, chicken wire. Yeah. So it was good.
Cool. And then the other question I had, because I really, really like him myself, is playing with Kenny Aronoff.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
The drummer. For those of you who don't know, he's the drummer. You can explain who he is.
Yeah. So that was kind of a fluke. A band that I worked in for quite a few years was a house band at a country venue here in Chicago. And we were playing every week, and we showed up for our weekly gig. And we noticed that our opening act had some road cases that had the name Kenny Aronoff on the side of it. And we were just like, oh, that's interesting. That drummer apparently bought Kenny Aronoff's old road cases. And it turns out then the opening act goes up, and it's actually Kenny Aronoff playing drums in this band. And it was, we were stunned, to see, and the fact that he was opening for us.
Yeah.
It was completely backwards, and he had just gotten flown in to do this one gig. There was an act that was signed to some label, and they needed a drummer, and they flew Kenny Aronoff in from wherever he was at. And he was a really cool guy, just super nice and full of personality. And we asked him to play with us, and he came up and played a few songs with us. And
he's great.
He's so good.
He for those of you who may not know who he is, I know him from John Mellencamp records.
Yes.
Scarecrow. I think the better John Mellencamp records. I mean, because of the beat, and he hits the hell out of those drums.
Yes, he is one of the loudest drummers, I think, on earth.
And you see him. He also is the drummer for the house band on like the Kennedy Center Presents. When they do the artists every year.
Oh, really?
And I've seen him back up all these other people. Like he backed up when they brought the Who in they got awards. He backed up all the people who were singing. So he's doing a plausible Keith Moon, know, but he's pounding. He's got these big old biceps.
Yeah.
I mean, he's really great. But he can keep beat. And I also heard this about him, that he has drum kits because he does a lot of session work. Yeah. So he's got drum kits he just leaves in cities. And I think he might have one here in Chicago.
Well, that would make sense.
And so he just flies. Yeah, I am not a musician, so I don't know this, but I am a fan. So anyway, I saw those two things on your website, and that's really, really cool. Yeah. So you were at the Old Town School of Folk Music.
Yes.
How long have you been there, and what are you teaching?
So I've been there. It'll be 21 years in October. I started there when I was fairly young. I guess I was 26, I think, when I started teaching there, and I teach primarily, it's guitar, but I also do ukulele. I've taught music theory. I do quite a few ensembles. I do a country music ensemble, a rockabilly ensemble.
Is that like a full-time gig for you? I mean, I know you play in bands, and I know you do a lot of session work, but is that a job?
At this point, I would say, I mean, I'm considered to be a full-time faculty there, so yes.
And what's it like? I mean, because this goes all over the country. Actually, we have listeners in England. Hello, England. London calling now. So explain Old Town to folks who may not know it.
So the Old Town School of Folk Music is a community music school located here in Chicago. It was started in 1957 by three people, Don Greening, Win Strachey, and Frank Hamilton. And they're in their own right, they're three people that are kind of, folk icons for people that have known folk music. Frank Hamilton famously was one of the musicians in the Weavers with Pete Seeger.
Oh, wow.
The school has had a long history. It started as just a folk school. And one of the distinctions about that's really different, in at least for those of us that work at the Old Town Innovative, is the way of teaching music was that it's in the folk tradition. So rather than having this very pedagogical style of teaching that you would have based out of like a music school, for example, and I went to music school myself, the tradition is very much centered around this idea of folks teaching other folks how to play music. Wow. And a lot of that, Frank Hamilton, for example, who's still alive and still teaching, and those of us that teach at the school consider him to be one of our mentors. He has a belief that you should teach most things by telling people rather than writing it down.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that are different about the approach than what you would get in a more traditional music type of education.
Well, I mean, for those of us who live in Chicago, Old Town is just this institution everyone's known about. I mean, I've bought a guitar there.
Yeah.
I've gone to shows there. They've got a beautiful space up in Lincoln Square in this neighborhood. But as a student, or as someone who may want to be a student, you don't have to have any experience. Do you teach all levels, or
all levels?
And so just talk. Someone calls up and says, "I want to take a class." What's the process there? What happens, and how did they get placed? And then, as a teacher, what do you do?
So, that's a great question. There's no auditions. In fact, even in our ensembles, which I teach, it's not like you have to audition. I've had people show up to take an ensemble class, for example. And by the way, I should clarify that most of the students I have taught in my 21 years of teaching have been adults. But I do teach children. I teach as young as 8.
Wow.
And I have taught, I think the oldest student I had was a woman who was in her mid-90s.
Oh, wow.
And decided she wanted to start playing guitar.
Sweet.
Yeah, it was
That's nice.
one of the most memorable things. And, a person will call the school and just say what they're interested in, and there's no questions asked. We just welcome them with open arms. And, part of the strength of our teaching staff at the school is that we are able to take people of all musical expertise levels and open our arms to them and find a way to try and get them making music.
Wow.
One of our objectives, for example, with the guitar program, when a person shows up for a beginning adult guitar class, our objective is that we're going to have them playing a song by the end of the first class.
Wow.
I mean, it's not going to be a hard song, but it's a song. And it's always kind of remarkable to the people in the class that, oh my gosh, I can't believe 80 minutes ago, I didn't even know how to hold this thing right. And now I am doing this,
That's amazing. I mean, I've said here before that often teaching in the arts is magic. It's like what you just described. 80 minutes earlier, they didn't know how to hold it correctly, and then they play a song. Yep. That's really amazing. So these are group classes mostly then?
Everything.
Singles and solo?
Yeah.
Wow.
So one of the things that the Old Town did that was part of say if we were to go back to 1957, it was the group class setting. So that is kind of at that time was unique to be taking that in, a large group of adults and trying to teach beginning,
It's like herding cats. I mean, I hate that phrase, but I mean, you have to have some, even every beginner is at a different level. I mean, I know enough guitar that I'm not a beginner, but I would be in a beginning class, I think. But, there's some people who've never touched it before.
Absolutely. Well, most of the people, the assumption, and we say this when we start with beginners, is that, we're going to assume that you know nothing. Okay. It's not to insult your intelligence, but some of you generally do know nothing about what we're doing. Some of you know something. And it's a varied group that you get, but we do have private lessons. There are some students that don't respond well to group teaching. And those people you try and steer into individual lessons. And there's some that don't respond well to individual lessons. The group class setting is a very social type of learning experience, at least the way that I like to do it and the way that I think the Old Town likes to do it. And it just creates this really kinetic type of positivity that being around a group of other adults and that are just like, man, this is, oh, wow, you don't know anything either. That's great, And so it's this empowering type of space that people get to come into as adults and learn in music, learn art.
We're going to go back in history in just a minute, but since we're on this thread, so how many classes make up a course, or how does that work? I mean, you said 80 minutes. I mean, if I'm a student, what do I sign up for, I guess?
So the time is, we basically have 80-minute classes, and I'm speaking specifically to the guitar and other instruments, because we do all the instruments. I mean, there's fiddle, there's, we have accordion classes. I mean, it's pretty amazing the the breadth of the course offerings that we have. But at least in the guitar program, which is what I know the best, there are 80-minute classes, and there's a 10-minute sort of post-class, pre-class, like intermission when they change around. But and then we also, so that's what a person signs up for. It's for an 8-week session. And
how many days a week?
1 day a week.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's it. Wow.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of contact hours then.
It's not.
But good for them. I mean, they're working professionals or they're in school or they're doing something else, right?
Yeah. I mean, since I know that your background is in
film.
In
college.
In college,
Yeah.
I was going to say, in higher education, we're very, one of the interesting things that I learned early on at the school, I was fairly recent out of studying at music school. I went to DePaul University here in Chicago, and that's very much a conservatory environment. And one of the things I learned early on was that the type of teaching that I had been exposed to was not going to work in the type of teaching that I was starting at the Old Town. And I've actually come to really embrace that. And I've had opportunities over the years to, teach it some, or I should say, there's been opportunities I've had to pursue teaching at the university level. And I've had these like hard, sort of discussions with myself, and I've realized, this is like this type of teaching that I do at the Old Town, the community teaching, the beginner students mostly. I have some advanced students as well, but that like speaks to my soul and my core mission as a teacher.
Well, let's talk about that before we go back. You brought it up. I mean, this show is called Teaching in the Arts. What is the difference? I mean, the conservatory, method is different from what you do. So describe those two differences for those of us who may not know from conservatory.
Well, the type of teaching that at least the Old Town puts forth is about enrichment. And, adults and even kids, that come, kids nowadays, I mean, the one thing that I've noticed with my kid students is compared to, say, 20 years ago when I started, these kids come in and they're like, okay, it's like they got like their schedule out. Okay, this is like my 30-minute lesson. I got an appointment after this to do yoga or whatever that kid is. It's amazing how like tightly scheduled kids are these days. Adults obviously know different. And I'm a parent, and I understand. I get it. These are people that work, many of them long and stressful jobs all day, and they have literally taken this initiative in their life to say, I want to do something that is for me, that is about, creating beauty or, doing something expressive. I mean, that just doing that, just saying that themselves, to me, is something that as a teacher, I need to respect and understand. If they show up, I've gotten to the point now where if an adult shows up and they're like, I have not picked up my guitar since our last lesson. I am completely okay with that because they made it to their lesson.
Right.
And I'm like, if nothing else, this is going to be a 30 or 45 minute or 60-minute time that you and I are going to get to spend together being musical.
Wow.
And experiencing art together. And I get to share, my passion with them, and they get to sort of reflect their passion back onto me. So it's always a positive experience for me. I've rarely had a negative experience with students in the community setting. In the conservatory setting, your objective is very much to prepare your students for a professional career.
It's competitive, much more competitive.
It's competitive,
yeah.
And it's
competitive to get in, I guess, too.
Competitive to get in.
Yeah.
I mean, when I'll occasionally, students will just inquire and be interested in my background, and when I tell them the amount of practice that the typical music student does, they're just, they can't even believe it.
Right.
They're like,
it's a job. I mean, it's a full-time job. It's like being a professional athlete.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, 5 or 6 hours a day of practice was very average for me when I was in music school.
Oh.
I wanted to do it. I mean, it's not,
sure.
I mean, no one was putting forcing me to do it, but they're just, most people are just baffled by that. Like, how you were like 19? And, like, didn't you go to parties and stuff? I'm like, no, like, I didn't, it just wasn't time for that. And so it's a very distinct and stark difference, at least in my mind, as to the type of educational mission that you would have at a conservatory type of program versus what the Old Town's offering.
Mm-hmm. Wow, great. But you brought up being 19 and being in music school. So let's go back. You're from Ohio, like outside of Columbus or somewhere like that?
Yeah, it's a small town. It's about 30 minutes or so, 45 minutes north of Columbus.
What brothers, sisters?
Yeah, I have actually an identical twin brother who's also a musician as well.
Wow.
He did it full time for about 20 years and then sadly, but also probably smartly decided to get out of it and get into something that's not musical related. But he still plays a lot. He's a professional level musician. That's
what parents, were they musical? They must be, I'm guessing.
I should also mention I have a sister too, who is an academic. She's not musical, but she teaches at the university level.
Oh wow, where does she teach?
She's a biomedical anthropologist.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, I could explain, but that would be going off topic pretty heavily at this point. So, I'm sorry. What was
parents? I mean, did they push you? They didn't push you to music.
No, they did. Yeah. One of my great many pieces of gratitude I have towards my parents is that. My interpretation of them is that they always wanted to be musicians, but they weren't. My mother did play a few chords on the guitar, and she was the one who taught me my first chords and my first songs too. There was like 3 songs I think she taught me, and one of them was they all used the same 4 chords in the same order. And I think 2 of them were maybe even old sorority songs that she used to sing.
That worked real well for you.
Right. But but she was an art teacher, taught high school art, and is a really fine artist as well. My father he's passed away now, but he had a great, wonderful singing voice. Didn't play any instruments. And so there was always music in the house. My parents, we were like the Chevy Chase, what was that, vacation movie when you go on vacations and they start singing all the corny old folk songs? That was my parents in the car. So we were always singing in the car. There was always a record on the turntable in my house.
What were some of the early songs or music that turned you on?
Folk music.
Yeah,
my parents loved folk music. Kingston Trio.
Sure, my parents I remember their shirts.
Yeah, exactly. Peter, Paul, and Mary was played a lot. The one that had the biggest impact on me, though, was Paul Simon. And we had a lot of Simon and Garfunkel and Paul Simon playing in my house. And my dad was also a big country music lover. So, Glenn Campbell and Linda Ronstadt and Olivia Newton-John, actually. She had some sort of country type of records. A lot of people.
Anticipation? Yeah, right.
So it just was one of these things that I was just, in fact, the television was not something that I was very limited as far as what I was allowed to watch on TV. And one of the only shows that I remember watching, at least when I was young, was incidentally was Hee Haw.
I was going to think that, yeah. But they had some good acts on there.
Unbelievable.
I mean, and hey, Buck Owens and Roy Clark can play.
Yeah, to say the least. That's Buck Owens is when I tell people about Hee Haw, they always kind of snicker a little bit. But I'm like, you got to understand, Buck Owens was like the guy that like started the Bakersfield sound, or at least one of the main innovators of that, which is a huge, at least for those of us that like country music, that's a huge thing.
Absolutely.
And then Roy Clark, and actually, Roy Clark for me was the one where I have a very vivid memory of standing in front of the television. And Roy Clark would, a lot of times on Hee Haw, would do this like solo piece. So they just let him come out without any band, and he would play like a solo thing. And I have such a vivid memory, probably being 6 or 7, and just watching him do this and like, what is this guy doing? That is so amazing.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that era of television, there was a lot of variety shows on. So, the Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour. Now, I'm a little older than you, so I remember some of that stuff. But, you got to see Glenn Campbell. You got to see Johnny Cash. I remember Johnny Cash's show.
Yeah.
And I think you can probably find it all on YouTube now.
Yes.
But these were really great musicians. Glenn Campbell, like Buck Owens, great musician.
Unbelievable.
And those are good people to be influenced by. So
I would actually like to interject that Glenn Campbell the Old Town, aside from being a school, we do have concerts.
Mm-hmm.
And Glenn Campbell actually performed at the Old Town School a couple years ago, and I got to take my father to see him.
So there was a Glenn Campbell show. This was before at Old Town, before it was known he was sick with Alzheimer's.
We may be talking about the same show.
And at one point, he played a song, and then he had a little intro, and he started playing the same song again. And his band leader said, "Oh, your musical director, oh, Glenn, you're such a kidder. You know, we just did that song." And they laughed, and then he played another song, and it was okay. No one knew. Like, it was just like this weird moment, this weird Glenn Campbell moment. And then 3 years later, this had to have been 2005, maybe? Yeah, something like that. And he started, and it was like, whoa, that was strange. And we had no idea. And then a few years later, you heard about that. But you know, it was sad. That movie about his life and with Alzheimer's at the end is a really good movie. I forget the name of it, but just Glenn Campbell documentary, you'll see it.
Well, there was one moment from that show as a teacher that I always like to tell my students, because he was playing, and it's similar to what you're describing. He sort of had this moment where, you know, he would, and you mentioned his keyboard player. Clearly, his keyboard player was sort of running the band. And there was times in the show where he would go back to the keyboard player and say, "Hey, what key is this in again?" You know? And the keyboard player was always like, good-natured about it. He'd say whatever key. And then at one point, and, you know, Glenn had his capo that he was sort of fussing with on his guitar. And for those of you that don't know what a capo is, it's a bar that you can clip onto the neck of your guitar to play in different keys without having to change the chord shapes that you're using. And he stopped at one point. He sort of looked up at the audience. He's like, actually, this is a school. And he goes, "Let me tell you what I'm doing right here." And so he starts talking about his capo. And I just thought that was, first of all, I loved that because Glenn Campbell, he's playing that. Like you said, we have this gorgeous music venue. It's won, these acoustical design awards. But he did recognize that this, first and foremost, was a school. And he's like, "You know what? I can talk about this." And so he's like explaining. I just thought that was a really cool thing that happened at that show.
You see it in the documentary even when he was getting sick. When he starts playing, he locks in. He whatever thing fires in his brain, he knew how to play still, and he could sing. And it was, what a tragic thing. So I love the story, but let's go back to you. So your mom was teaching you some guitar. Then you must have taken lessons or been pushed some direction.
Well, interestingly, because the town I grew up in was a pretty, at least back then, was a small town, a farming community that was in transition. I actually worked on a farm when I was in high school. So we didn't have any guitar instructors in my town. I actually was self-taught for the first couple years. And then my parents I recognized that I was really into this, because I'd get home from school and the first thing I'd do is I'd pick up my guitar.
Oh, nice.
I had started on the violin as a first instrument. And so they, much to my, never-ending appreciation, would take me into Columbus once a week to a music store that had a guitar teacher. And we did that. That was a 45-minute drive each way, But we did that until that guitar teacher quit, which was not too long after I started lessons. I hope I didn't have anything to do with that. But and looking back, I realized he actually wasn't a good teacher at all. One of the first songs he tried to teach me was one of the first songs he tried to teach me was Norwegian Wood by the Beatles. And I just, I remember being so frustrated. I'm like, I can't do this. I can't do this. That was like my one thing I thought in my mind.
Wow.
And I'm looking back.
How discouraging.
Yeah, it was really discouraging. I didn't have, of course, no beginner realizes that you do not teach Norwegian Wood as your first song to a student.
Right.
But we stuck with it I stuck with it for him for probably about a year. And then I didn't have lessons for a while, but I was, learning enough on my own. It's, sort of one of those stories about people that just listen to music a lot. And I had this book of Beatles songs. I was a big, 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 big Beatles fan. And, back in the, mid 80s and early 80s, which is what I'm talking about now, when I was a young adolescent, that was not the cool bands to be listening to, when you're in middle school. And I used to get teased mercilessly by my classmates about the music choices I was into. But I did find this book of Beatles songs that had all the little chord grids.
Yeah.
And so that's actually how I taught myself how to play most of my chords.
Wow.
And by the time I got to high school, we were able to find a teacher that was affiliated with the Ohio State University to actually teach me how to read music and learn how to play classical guitar well enough that I was able to audition for music schools and such.
Wow. So what did your parents think when you said you wanted to go to music school or conservatory or something?
Never batted an eye.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, because I in a future episode, I talked to a couple of students, and one student is a voice student at Northwestern, wanted to study opera, actually does study opera. The other is from India, and his parents, and he jokes about it, had the discussion, and so they wanted him to be an engineer. And so he said, I want to be a film student, so he's dual majoring,
Yeah.
And but because he had to, that's the only way he was going to get from India to this country and go to film school. But I'm so glad to hear that your parents were supportive that way. So you went to DePaul, right?
Yeah.
Did you
may have, I'm sure maybe in private conversations, like, oh, what are we going to do? They want to go to, but never to me, I never had any doubt that they were or still, supportive.
Yeah. Where'd your twin brother go?
Same. We
both went to DePaul at the same time. Wow. Yeah. So did you look at other schools? I mean, Berkeley or where, and other places? Where else?
That's going back in time now. But there was probably about 8 schools, I think, that I looked at. I auditioned at probably 6 of the 8.
So you had to audition to get into DePaul?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, every school had a pretty extensive audition process, even back then.
Oh.
And
did you have to do it in person, or could you give a tape? Yeah.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
It was all in person.
Pre-internet. Yeah. Yeah.
And the big deciding factor for me, though, in choosing a school was that I knew specifically that I wanted to study what's called jazz studies.
Mm-hmm.
Not because I wanted to be a jazz musician, but because I wanted to learn the broadest set of skills. And that seemed to be back in 89, there was only maybe 20 programs and then maybe 30, I don't know, I'd have to look, in the entire country that did that.
Wow.
And so that helped to narrow things down quite a bit. I didn't look at Berkeley. But
Michigan has a conservatory, I know. Maybe that's
University
for singing.
of Michigan. Yeah. And back in, now I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. But although my wife actually, believe it or not, is from Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
So,
Go Blue.
Yeah, right. But back in 89, I don't believe they had any jazz studies.
So what did you, when you went away to school and you wanted to study, this, what did you think you were going to do? What did you think your career path was going to be? I can't imagine you thought, hey, I'm going to be a teacher. What did you think you were going to do?
That's a great question. And I had no idea how it was going to end up. All I knew that I wanted was to make a living as a musician.
Oh, that's great.
That was my goal.
Yeah.
And whatever I needed to do, this is my mindset when I was 19. Mm-hmm. Whatever I had to do to make that happen, that's just what I was going to do. And, I'm sure you're probably familiar with this, or a variation of this piece of advice, but I was reading an interview in a magazine, it was like in a guitar magazine of all people, it was, I want to say it was Steve Vai, who, if you don't know who Steve Vai is, he's like one of these like sort of guitar, like shreddy, guitar wizard kind of guys. And amazing player. Not exactly the type of music that I'm into, but I acknowledge that he's an incredible player. And he's actually was saying that he does a lot of these clinics, and a lot of times young, guitar students will ask him, okay, if I'm thinking about going into music, what would you recommend? And he says not to come off as crass, but he's like, if you're thinking about going into music as a career, don't do it. Because it's not about, he says everyone that he knows that does it as a career, they don't think about it. It's just what you do. It's like there's no plan B.
Right.
And that's always stuck as really strong with me, because if I'd had any other option available to me in my mind, I don't know. I don't know where things would have ended up,
Yeah.
but there never was another option.
Yeah, I completely get that. I mean, you don't go do it for the money. The money may come. You may be great. You may be. You're hitting the lottery. In some ways. I mean, no matter how good you are, there is a line out the door of great musicians who no one's ever heard of.
Exactly.
And that's not their fault. I'm sure they're living happy lives and stuff like that. The analogy I use is there are thousands of pilots. There are hundreds of airline pilots. There are 36 astronauts, and only 12 men have walked on the moon. So you get in that line to be a pilot, but you're not going to walk on the moon. And you're like, it's just small, but you've got to just keep at it. You just got to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. So you're in school, and what's that experience like? I mean, you said you practice 5-6 hours a day.
Well, one thing that happened right off the bat, I was I showed up. Like I mentioned earlier, the town I grew up in was small. Columbus, Ohio, now is a amazing scene now.
Yeah.
It's amazing what's going on in Columbus, Ohio right now. But when I was growing up, it was literally the definition of a cow town. And I showed up to Chicago and not at all prepared for what I was about. I mean, the elevation of everything was just like way above what I was expecting.
A lot of good guitar players from every other city that came. You were certainly not the best anymore.
No. And I showed up to music school, and it was like, wow, like there was other guitar players at the school that could, just sight read circles around me. And so I was in a position where I was feeling like I had a lot of catch up to do, as far as like my skills. It was a real eye opener for me in a good way. I mean, I was really actually, rather than being discouraged by that, I was really I seized that as like an encouragement, and
it makes you get better.
Yeah, I try to feed off of that.
Yeah, of course.
I've never been a competitive person. I was, every attempt I ever had at sports as a young person, always, we'd lose a game, and I just like, oh, okay, well, that was fun. I just never.
That's actually a really good attitude to have. But yeah.
And that's extended to music too. When I come across other musicians, I mean, at the Old Town School where I teach now, there are world-class musicians there, and it's not an exaggeration when I say that. And I should say that these are world-class musicians that have chosen to teach beginners. It's a really amazing thing. And I don't get intimidated by that. I'm not like, Chris Walls can play, circles around me when it comes to bluegrass picking, and I'm doggone it, I'm just going to quit now. It's like, I just get really inspired by that. I get to be around that. And it was the same in music school.
I bet that happens in your group classes too. That if you've got how many students are in a group class on average?
Well, it varies greatly. I mean, I'm actually teaching a adult beginner classical guitar class right now, and that's a kind of a niche piece of guitar playing, and so we have usually about 6 to 8 students in that.
If I'm number 7 of 8, and see that number 1 is that much better, I'm going to want to get in there and see what he's doing or she's doing and play better, as opposed to turn tail and go home.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I try to do as a teacher, and one of the challenges that I am constantly presented with this style of teaching, is sort of assessing the level of the students and hopefully being able to find a little bit for everybody. And because there is a range, there is a range. And every now and then you will get that one student that just is not placed right. And you have to either have a talk with them or, maybe they just decide to stop doing it. But generally speaking, I try to find a middle ground where we can all meet. The ensembles are actually a great opportunity for that, because I have some people that show up that play, like my country ensemble I teach. I have 3 fiddle players. I have a lap steel player. We have, bass. We have a whole splatter of guitar players. We have a couple people that just sing. I mean, this is like there's like 16 people in this class. Wow. Okay. And some of them can play like, just the basic guitar chords. And others of them can do, some lead stuff. So there's a whole different range. And just like in a band, you're like, well, this is your strength. And this is your strength. And as the teacher, I try to manage everyone's strengths so that they all feel like they're contributing.
Wow. Whew. That's a lot to go on because you gotta have to assess the group, pretty quickly. If it's only an 8-week class, 1 day a week, and then you've got to place them, and you've got to then massage some egos, probably. Even though adults are maybe a little bit easier,
are pretty good.
And they understand their weaknesses. If I see that you're better than I am, I'm going to say, yeah, he's better. I'll do this thing I'm okay at.
I would say if anything, more than massaging egos, at least teaching adults as I'm experiencing it. Although I have had some students that were difficult, but they're very, very much in the minority. Mm-hmm. It's more about encouraging them and making them not like, you can do this.
Wow.
And this is okay. If you get up on the mic, I mean, one of the absolute most favorite things for me as a teacher, and using the ensembles as an example, is when I get a person that has never in their life gotten up on a microphone and sung in front of a band, gets to do that in class. And it's a really powerful thing to see it, because here's a person that could be 60 years old and they've always wanted to do this, and you get to do that, and you get to help that happen. And it's just like it's
dream
really
making.
Yeah. And they might get up, and if I was purely from a musical perspective, I mean, I don't even judge like what is, was that on key or was that, I mean, that's not the point.
Yeah.
That's so not the point. And it's just it's more about encouraging them and making them feel like this is okay. This is a safe space for you to be, making music.
I'm somewhat sorry that this is not videotaped, because you're so excited, and I see it in your eyes. You're so passionate about trying to help people, and it just pours off you. That's really great. You. So okay, we get through college. Did you ever think, hey, I'm going to be in a band, or I'm going to make it that way? And
well, I've always played in bands, and truth be told, I would say up until just the last few years, that's been the primary source of my income, even though I do teach, over 20 hours a week. So my performing and professional career, I guess we could call it, has always been, the main income for me, playing gigs, doing recording sessions.
The chicken coop gig.
The chicken coop. Yeah. Oh boy, I've had some weird ones, let me tell you. But, the joke is like right when you think you've done everything, you show up and then there's the chicken coop, But
sessions, you do like jingles and stuff like that. Right?
Although I haven't done any jingles in a couple years, but there was a run there. I was working with a studio here in Chicago for about 5 years, and I did quite a few jingles. I actually back when Barack Obama was running for his first running for president, I got to play on. I was playing guitar on several of his campaign commercials, which that was when I was kind of it wasn't but there was like Oscar Mayer Wiener and all that stuff too. So.
Your whole productions. I was a studio.
That's what it was.
Eric is a good friend of mine.
Oh,
Eric Sproul.
That's who I worked with.
I've said he is a subscriber to this show.
Oh,
hey,
my
Eric.
God. Hey, Eric.
He's in Ann Arbor.
I know.
Yeah.
I haven't spoken. Oh my goodness.
As soon as you were going down the Obama path, I knew it was that.
Yeah, Eric was great. He was the guy that I worked with, and I obviously just love Eric, and he was super talented. Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah.
Unbelievably
he is. He's a great guy, and we will. He and I were trading texts yesterday. As a matter of fact, I knew him from college.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
He played on a song I made a music video for, and then he scored the music. He scored a lot of stuff I've done, including the feature I made and stuff like that.
Oh,
so as soon as you said Obama and political stuff, yeah. No, so hi, Eric. Yeah. so okay, you're doing this stuff, and when did you pivot to teaching? I mean, how did that all happen?
Well, I started right when I got out of music school. I had this belief that I was always kind of planning for how am I'm not going to be able to make a living as a musician performing. Mm-hmm. I just had convinced myself. And so I need to have these other, what am I going to do as my thing that's going to enable me to perform and put, food in my mouth. Teaching is something that's in my family's, sort of bloodline, as I mentioned earlier. My mother is was a teacher. She's retired now.
What'd she teach?
Art.
Wow.
And my father, before he got into the work that he did his whole life, and he did nonprofit work, was a teacher as well. So I actually was able to get a job at the University of Chicago Lab Schools as a substitute music and art teacher.
Wow.
And I did that for about, I don't know, 2 or 3 years.
What grades were you teaching? All of them?
Yeah, up through high school.
Yeah, great school.
Yeah. And it was a good experience. And but then I started teaching at the Old Town School. I got, and it wasn't, getting a job at the Old Town is not, and it's not an easy place to get a job.
Yeah, they have a high bar.
They do have a high bar. It was actually, I think, the second or third time I'd interviewed that I finally got offered the job. And for various, I think I'd interviewed for a position there maybe right after music school, and they were like, "No, this guy's too green," And but I did get the job. And
what was that first class? Do you remember?
When I started, I wasn't teaching classes. It was only private lessons. So I think, and that was smart. For the first several, maybe I want to say, I don't think I taught a class there until I'd been there for maybe a year or two. But the first class was great. I just.
How did you know how to teach? I mean, they didn't, there's not a syllabus, I don't think, in that class. How did you know what to do? Yes, you had taken classes, but how'd you know?
Well, to be honest with you, I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that you just kind of was making up as I was making up as I was going along. Everyone has a different approach, as you know, to how they teach. A lot of what I've been doing, I do see a lot of correlation between teaching and performing in the sense that, as a performer, you have your repertoire and you have your way of playing your music that, speaks to you and what you're trying to do as an artist. When I teach, I have my repertoire as a teacher, and my way of presenting it is also like my repertoire,
Sure.
So
yeah.
I don't know if that
lessons. Like, can you describe a little bit?
There'll be if I'm trying to get a concept across about, because teaching, as you've covered, a lot in your podcast, teaching art is a abstract thing. It's like you said earlier, it's not 2 + 2 = 4. And trying to explain a concept such as music theory, or like even something that to like a musician, you're like, this is so, incredibly easy. Like you would assume that people would instantly get the concept of a bar of music, 4 beats per measure. You'd be surprised how many people do not get that.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first things I remember. One of my earliest memories of teaching was guitar. I had a student, the beginner student, and I showed him the D chord, which at the Old Town, generally we start with the D chord on the guitar. And I showed it to them. They put their fingers in the right spot, and they were
I'm doing it now myself.
Right. Playing the D chord, and they were. It just wasn't. It sounded horrible, and they knew. And fortunately, they recognized that it sounded horrible and wrong, and they were like, "Well," and they said to me, "Like, why isn't this sound right? My hands are in the right spot. Why doesn't it sound right?" And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know. Why doesn't it sound right? That was like my first realization as a teacher. And like I said, I didn't know what I was doing yet. I was like, this teaching thing is a lot more of a thing than I think I realized. Then I had to like really start thinking about, okay, why is it that they don't? And so now I have like a whole repertoire, so to speak, of reasons that have taken me, years and a lot of analysis and interest, genuine interest, to try and understand, okay, why is it that they can't make their fingers do this? Or, with explaining something like a measure to a student, I won't bore you with the details.
No, it's fascinating. I like being in the weeds.
Yeah. So, with the guitar chords, it might just be because this finger, it's rubbing up against that other string, and that's why that string's not sounding right now. Or, you're holding, right now you're sticking your thumb like on the other side of the neck, and it's supposed to be on this side of the neck. Or, you're holding the guitar backwards, or not that, but something like that. So.
It's too bad you're not passionate about your students and teaching.
I know, right? It'd be so much better if I was.
This is really great. So they, is there some sort of evaluation process? There must be. You must have taught that first class somewhat probationary. They didn't know you. The school didn't know you. They didn't know how it was going to work out. How did you know it was a fit, and how did Old Town know it was a fit with you?
Well, one of the testaments I should mention is that the guy who hired me and who is still involved with the Old Town, he was the education director at the time. His name's Michael Miles. He actually stopped being the education director a number of years ago so that he could put more focus into his performing career. He's a world-class banjo player, and he travels all over the world doing concerts. But he had a real knack for finding good teachers. And it's a real, I think, underappreciated skill in music schools, because even you're nodding your head in agreement in any probably arts institution.
Just because you're good at it does not mean you can translate that to teaching. You've got to, like it's why when I joked about you caring. I mean, it's clear that you care about the work, discussing it with students, and not everyone's like that. They're just like, I'm good at this. I think I could teach.
Yes. And, there's, one of the, some teachers, and I definitely had these in music school. Clearly they're great. I mean, that you can't be, what gets you in the door is your playing ability. Okay. That's, right. That's a given. So, what keeps you there and makes you successful as a teacher is a whole other set of X factors that I think Michael Miles, the guy that hired me, had, like I said earlier, had a real knack for recognizing that in teachers. I had teachers at DePaul that were every single teacher I had was an amazing player, like mind-blowingly good player, But I only had one or two, to be honest with you, that were really good teachers, that I feel like I really learned a lot from.
Yeah, well, who? I mean, I always ask, who are your influences? You mentioned musical influences. You talked about Simon and all the others. But who are some of your academic influences?
Well, I studied with Mark Maxwell at DePaul, who is the classical guitar head of the classical guitar program, and he is still the head of the program there. He was a great teacher. I learned an incredible amount from him, and even though classical guitar was like my second major, my main major was jazz studies. I am so grateful for everything that he taught me. So fortunately, my main instrument and the teacher that I studied with, I felt was very good.
Good fit.
Yeah. If that hadn't been the case, I probably would have had to either transfer, whatever. I think that's probably a key thing.
Wow. How many times did you have him through your school?
I've tried to think about...
more than once.
More than once
more than one class.
Oh, yeah. Well, I took individual lessons with him. I can't remember if that was once or twice a week. Wow. He there was also some group classes. There was some ensembles that he taught. I mean, I was with him through all 4 years. I was there. There was another teacher there by the name of Alan Swain, who is pretty well known here in Chicago. He's I don't know how old he is now. I know he's still alive, but he's I would guess he's well into his 80s. But he's written a number of books on jazz harmony and music theory, and that's what he was teaching at DePaul when I was there, a piano teacher. And I learned an incredible amount from Alan Swain. He had, and the thing that, I want to say one thing too about Alan is that I would say most of what I learned from him wasn't even necessarily the information. One of the most important things I learned from Alan is the importance of having, he had an approach to teaching. It wasn't something that he just sort of did off the cuff.
I think that's really important. I think that's important not only in teaching, but in almost anything anyone does. Don't do it all ad hoc. You know, if you're cooking, have an approach to how you're going to cook. I like using these ingredients. I don't need a recipe. I like doing this. I mean, I know I have an approach to teaching as well, but what was his approach?
Well, interestingly, I only took 1 or 2 classes from him. He was a piano instructor at the school on top of doing the theory stuff. So I can play chopsticks on the piano. So, I didn't do any of that. But his approach is and the one thing I will say was that his approach was very it was very dogmatic. I mean, he had this. It's very this is what you do to do this, and this is what you do to this. And I think that's important to have that as one approach. One of the things that I have learned, or at least I should say I've come to believe in my teaching, and this is part of my repertoire, by the way, that I mentioned as a teacher. I'll share this with you, is that I've found that if you're looking at any individual piece of information that either you're trying to teach or, in my case, even if you're trying to learn, it's essential. It's essential to look at it and explain it to yourself from at least two vantage points. Now, one of the drawbacks I got in the conservatory learning that I had was that most information was presented to you one way. Mm-hmm. And it was often presented to you in a way like, okay, this is how it's done, and do not deviate.
Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, I don't either. and furthermore, it's not useful. Mm-hmm. Because I would get this piece of information, like, for example, I was learning about the modes, and it's this either really interesting or really incredibly boring thing, depending on what your viewpoint is. But I remember, and I understood it. I mean, I would get presented this information, and I would understand what the teacher was saying, but then I'd be holding my instrument in my hand. I'm like, I don't, what am I supposed to do with this,
right.
And years after music school, that I would then find an alternative presentation of it, and then all of a sudden it clicked from both sides.
Yeah, sure.
So the metaphor that I like to use is, imagine you have it's a point on a map. A piece of information is a point on a map, and if you say you move to a new house, and you only know how to get to your new house heading, north on Western Avenue, you don't really know where you live.
Yep.
Right? Mm-hmm. You want to be able to come into it from as many different angles as possible. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I do in my own learning, but also in my teaching, is encourage my students to try and always find at least one other way in.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that translates to any art. I mean, I was teaching a film class, beginning film class last week, and students were lighting something. They were lighting a set, and I said, "This is great. This is okay, but let's light the same setup differently. Let's look at, because if not, you're just going to keep doing this. You'll be a one-hit wonder. You're just doing this one thing over and over and over again." And they were like, "Oh yeah, let's look at the background. Let's do that." And we shot both, and they're like, "Wow, yeah, it's the same and different, but now I know two things, then as opposed to only knowing one thing."
That's great.
And
that's exactly.
Yeah, that must translate. But this is why I like talking to teachers. Yeah. This is great. So we got to wrap up here. You've got a sick child and a wife who has a job interview.
I do, yes.
but the any highlights you want to share of just teaching career? You talked about like watching someone step forward to sing in front of a band for the first time. Anything that pops to your mind?
Oh boy, there's a lot. I mean, I enjoy the little things. I think you can always point to like a big moment that you've had with students. And those are, few and far between. Mm-hmm. Like I mentioned, there was the woman who was, earlier I'd mentioned a student I'd had who was in her 90s and came to me. And she was severely arthritic. I mean, her fingers were so arthritic that she couldn't actually bend her fingers. Wow. And she wanted to learn to play the guitar, okay? And I'm like, what am I going to do?
I think a prerequisite would be bending your fingers.
Well, it kind of is, yeah, to be honest with you. And I was just looking at this, and I'm thinking, I'm not going to tell this 90-year-old woman that she can't do this. Mm-hmm. So I just tried to find a solution. And in that case, it was we tuned her guitar to an open chord, and then set the action really low, and then she just slide her finger up and down on the guitar, and she was totally happy.
Wow.
And to me, that was a huge success that I was able to do that.
You just hit on something that I've said a lot on this show, and people will get tired of it, but I believe creativity is problem solving. And that's all it really is. Yeah. And you just solved a problem. And that was very creative. That was a really creative solution as a teacher to help that woman. And you've solved a problem. You solved her problem. You solved your problem because, you had this one student here. Right. And to me, that's all creativity is. If you solve problems, you can do that.
I agree with that. That's a great, I'm going to be thinking about that when I'm driving home. But it's, I would say that the main, for me, it's the highlight for me as a teacher is just that I get to do this, and I get to do it every week. It's a great thing. It's a gift. It's a real gift.
I don't think there's anything more we can say. No. It is. That was great. This has been fantastic.
Oh, me too.
And I like doing this, and this is why the podcast exists. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you. Great.
Well, that's it. That's my talk with Jacob Sweet, and what a great conversation. Like I said at the start of this thing, it's why I wanted to do this podcast. I mean, we had never met, and fantastic. So I really like this. And as I said, we're going to pivot a little bit. We're talking to Jacob, who's at Old Town. Week after this is a couple of students in the arts. And then we're going international, bringing in a teacher from England. We're doing a Skype session with him and another teacher of mine, a former student of mine who's a teacher. But I want to thank Jacob, and I want to thank Kim and Dave at the Old Town School of Folk Music. And just this reminder, special thanks to Old Town School of Folk Music, who invites you to join a session of our 8-week group classes on guitar, banjo, dance, ukulele, and more. More details and registration at oldtownschool.org. Thanks, Kim and Dave, and thank you, Jacob. And now it's time for me to get a drink.